After graduating college, money was tight, but I managed to find a pretty cheap house in a more rural area. However, almost as soon as I moved in, I realized my next-door neighbor was not someone who I was going to be best friends with. His name was Bob, and right from the get-go, I realized there was something deeply unsettling about him. Bob was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a shock of unkempt gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. His house was in a state of disrepair, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, and there were always strange noises coming from inside. Bob himself was a recluse, rarely leaving his house except to tend to his overgrown garden or to take his nightly walks. I tried my best to be friendly at first, waving hello when I saw him, but he always just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. I tried to shrug it off, figuring he was just a grumpy old man, but then the strange things started happening. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud banging on my front door. I stumbled out of bed and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard another loud bang, this time on the side of the house. I ran to the window and looked out, but again, there was no one to be seen. The next day, I summoned up the courage to mention it to Bob, hoping for some reassurance or some kind of explanation. Instead, he just stared at me with those cold eyes and said, "You shouldn't be here, this isn't your place." I was taken aback by his hostility, but decided to brush it off as just another instance of his eccentricity. But the strange occurrences continued. I started seeing shadowy figures lurking in the trees at night, and the banging on my door became a nightly occurrence. I even started hearing whispers in the walls of my house, as if someone was trying to communicate with me. One night, I finally worked up the courage to confront Bob about what was happening. I knocked on his door, and after a long wait, he finally answered. His eyes were wild, and his hair was even more disheveled than usual. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. "This place is cursed, and you've brought the darkness with you." I was terrified, but I managed to stammer out a question. "What do you mean, cursed?" Bob just shook his head and slammed the door in my face. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again, only louder this time. And then, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once said, "Leave this place, leave now, or you will never be able to." The next morning, I packed my bags and left the house, never to return. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Bob standing in his yard, watching me leave. His eyes were still cold and unsettling. There was something else in them now. It looked like relief. A few years ago, I moved into a new apartment in what I thought was a relatively nice part of town. The building was old but well maintained, and my neighbors seemed friendly enough. I was particularly drawn to the elderly lady who lived across the hall from me. She was always smiling and would often stop to chat whenever we crossed paths. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a strange smell coming from her apartment. It was a mix of something sweet and something rotten. I knocked on her door, concerned that she might be ill, but there was no answer. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. With a growing sense of unease, I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, and the smell was overwhelming. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The sight that greeted me was horrifying, though. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood, and in the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror. But it was what was reflected in the mirror that made my blood run cold. In the mirror, I could see my neighbor, but she was not the kind old lady I knew. Her eyes were black, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She was holding a knife, and the reflection showed her advancing towards me. I screamed and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I called the police, and when they arrived, they found the old lady dead in her bedroom. The symbols on the walls were later identified as occult symbols, and the mirror was found to be cursed. There was no way I could go on living in that apartment with what just happened, and I moved out soon after. However, the memory of that night still haunts me. I never found out what really happened to my neighbor, or why she had that cursed mirror in her apartment. But I know one thing for sure: I will never forget the day I looked into that mirror and saw the true face of evil. I'm not sure if this qualifies as a neighbor horror story, but back in college I had the distinct misfortune of being paired up with a roommate from hell. Let me tell you, it was an experience that still haunts me to this day. It all started when I moved into my dorm room at the beginning of my sophomore year. My roommate seemed normal enough at first, a little quiet, but that was fine with me. I was more of an introvert myself, and I figured we could coexist peacefully. Boy, was I wrong. As the weeks went by, my roommate's behavior became increasingly bizarre. It started with small things. He would leave his dirty clothes strewn all over the floor, even after I politely asked him to clean up. Then he began hoarding food in our tiny shared fridge, leaving no room for my own groceries. But the real horror began when I started noticing strange noises coming from his side of the room. At first I thought it was just the creaky old dorm building, but the noises persisted even when the rest of the building was quiet. At first I tried to ignore it, but the sounds grew louder and more unsettling, scratching, thumping, and even what sounded like muffled voices. I tried to confront my roommate about it, but he always brushed me off, claiming he didn't hear anything. I even tried recording the noises, but when I played them back to him, he just laughed and said I was imagining things. Things took a turn for the worse when I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving in the darkness, figures lurking just outside of our door. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was becoming unbearable. One night, I woke up to the sound of a loud crash. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see my roommate's bed, but he wasn't in it. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I got out of bed and crept towards the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. When I opened it, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. There, in the hallway, was my roommate, standing over a pile of broken glass. He was holding a knife, and his eyes were wild and unfocused. I don't remember much after that. I must have screamed because the next thing I knew, campus security was there, and my roommate was being dragged away in cuffs. I never got the full backstory of what happened afterwards, but I can only imagine he had some type of mental issues. I never saw my roommate again. I moved out of that dorm room as soon as I could, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I can't help but wonder if there were warning signs that I missed. I also can't help but wonder about how things might have turned out differently. My wife and I moved to our current house about 5 years ago now, soon after our son Nathan was born. It was a quiet neighborhood, perfect for raising a family. Our neighbors were friendly for the most part, and we quickly became part of the community. However, one neighbor in particular caught my attention. His name was Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who lived alone in the house next door. He had a strange aura about him, always keeping to himself and rarely interacting with others. My wife and I tried to be friendly, but he seemed disinterested in our attempts to connect. As time passed, strange things started happening. Nathan, who was growing into a curious toddler, would often wander around our yard, exploring the world around him. One day, I noticed he had a new toy, a small wooden figure that I had never seen before. When I asked him where he got it, he simply pointed towards Mr. Jenkins' house. I didn't think much of it at first, but over the next few weeks, Nathan would come home with more and more of these wooden figures. I asked Mr. Jenkins about it, but he denied giving them to Nathan. I began to grow concerned, but my wife brushed it off as the ramblings of an old man who had nothing better to do. One night, I woke up to the sound of Nathan crying. I rushed to his room to find him sitting up in his bed, clutching one of the wooden figurines. He was terrified, mumbling about the bad man who had given him the toys. I tried to comfort him, but he was inconsolable. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Jenkins about the situation. As I approached his house, I noticed that the windows were all boarded up, and the front door was slightly ajar. I cautiously stepped inside, calling out for Mr. Jenkins, but there was no response. I walked through the dimly lit house, the floorboards creaking under my feet. As I reached the back room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was an altar of sorts, with a large wooden figurine in the shape of a child. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around to see Mr. Jenkins standing in the doorway, a twisted smile on his face. He lunged at me, and I barely managed to escape, running back to my house and locking the door behind me. That night, I called the police, and they searched Mr. Jenkins' house. They found evidence of dark rituals and even human sacrifices. Mr. Jenkins himself was nowhere to be found. We moved out of the house soon after, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if we had never moved next door to Mr. Jenkins. Thankfully, Nathan is now a happy and healthy child, but the memory of that house and the horrors we experienced there will haunt us forever. For a while after graduating college, I lived with my best friend Stan and one other guy named Kyle in this really cheap house in a bad part of town. Each of us had jobs, and we figured that being 3 strong young men, we could hold our own. We were wrong. The first few months were uneventful. We settled into a routine: work, eat, sleep, and repeat. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, an unsettling feeling crept over our humble abode. It started with small things: a misplaced key, a flickering light that no electrician could fix, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, one night, I saw him. Our neighbor. He was a tall, gaunt figure with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I caught him staring at our house, his gaze lingering on the windows where our bedrooms were. I told Stan and Kyle about it, but they brushed it off as paranoia. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as I was returning from work, I found the front door wide open. Inside, our belongings were strewn about, as if someone had been searching for something. The police came, but found no signs of forced entry. They suggested it might have been an animal or a gust of wind. Stan and Kyle started to believe me then, especially when they too began to notice the neighbor's unsettling presence. He would stand at his window, watching us, always watching. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching on my window. I pulled back the curtain to find the neighbor's face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed, and he disappeared into the night. The next day, I actually confronted him. He denied everything, of course, claiming he was just a concerned neighbor. But his eyes betrayed him. They were filled with a darkness that chilled me to the bone. That night, I heard him outside again. This time he was whispering. I couldn't quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a threat. I told Stan and Kyle we needed to leave. They agreed, and we packed our bags and left in the middle of the night. To this day, I don't know what our neighbor wanted or why he targeted us, but I do know that the darkness in his eyes was real, and I never want to see it again. A few years back, me and my friend Shelley rented a vacation home for a month in the Florida Keys. Everything started off picture perfect, until we met our neighbor on what I think was our 3rd night there. We were sitting on the deck, enjoying the warm ocean breeze and sipping on some cocktails we'd made, when a shadow fell over us. We looked up to see a man standing there, a strange smile on his face. He introduced himself as Tom, our neighbor from the house next door. At first, he seemed friendly enough, making small talk and asking about our vacation plans. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. For one thing, he seemed a little too interested in our comings and goings, asking detailed questions about our schedule and what we planned to do each day. As the days went by, we started noticing strange things as well. Little things, like items in our house being moved around, or doors left open that we were sure we'd closed. At first we chalked it up to our own forgetfulness, but the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing day. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. I lay there, frozen with fear, listening as the footsteps circled the house and faded away into the night. The next morning I told Shelley about it, and we decided to keep a closer eye on things. That's when we noticed Tom's car parked outside our house more often than not, even when we hadn't seen him around. We started feeling like we were being watched, like there were eyes on us wherever we went. The final straw came when we found a note slipped under our door. It was written in a shaky hand, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "I know your secrets. I've been watching you." We packed our bags and left that night, driving back to the mainland in a state of shock and fear. To this day, I still don't know exactly what Tom's intentions were, or what secrets he thought he had. But I do know one thing: I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to let our guard down. Everything I'm about to say will probably come across as a cliche, but about 10 years ago, I swear I lived next to the absolute worst neighbor on earth. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. That's why it was so jarring when the new guy moved in next door. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a thick head of white hair and a constant scowl on his face. He never spoke to anyone, just glared at us from behind his curtains. At first it was just minor annoyances. His lawn was always overgrown, and he'd leave his trash cans out for days after the garbage had been collected. But then things started to escalate. One night, I was woken up by a loud banging noise. I looked out my window and saw him in his backyard, hammering something into the fence that separated our properties. It was a series of metal spikes, each one sharp and menacing. From that point on, I started to notice other strange things as well. My cat went missing, and when I went to ask him if he'd seen her, he just stared at me blankly and shook his head. I started finding dead birds in my yard, their necks snapped. And then, one day, I came home to find a crude drawing on my front door. A stick figure with a knife through its heart. I tried to talk to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. It was just a drawing after all. But I knew better. I knew that something was seriously wrong with my neighbor. Things came to a head one night when I woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed, a knife in his hand. I screamed and he ran off, thankfully, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before he came back. Therefore, I moved out the very next day, and I never looked back. I still have nightmares about that house and about that man. And I'm convinced that if I hadn't left when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I remember a new family moved in next to us when I was about 7 and my younger brother was 5. The parents seemed nice, at least at first, but there was something weird and disturbing about their daughter, Sally. She was about my age, but she never smiled, not even when she played with us in the backyard. Her eyes were always wide and unblinking, like she was constantly on alert. One day, when we were playing hide and seek, I hid in a bush near the fence that separated our yards. As I crouched there, trying not to make a sound, I heard Sally whispering to herself, "They're coming." She said this over and over again. "They're coming to take us away." I didn't know who they were or what on earth she was talking about, but her voice sent chills down my spine. After that, I started noticing strange things happening around our house. My toys would go missing and then reappear in odd places. Our cat, who was usually friendly, hissed and arched her back whenever Sally came near. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear strange noises coming from next door. It sounded like someone was crying, but when I asked my parents about it, they said it was just the wind. As the weeks went by, Sally became more and more withdrawn. She stopped coming outside to play with us, and when I saw her through the window, she was always staring off into space, as if she was lost in her own world. I started to feel sorry for her, but at the same time I was also afraid. There was something wrong with her, but I didn't know what it was. One night, I woke up to the sound of a loud thud coming from next door. I got out of bed and looked out the window, but all I could see was darkness. I was about to go back to bed when I heard a soft voice calling my name. "Michael," it whispered. "Come outside." It was Sally. I crept downstairs and out the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. Sally was standing in the middle of her yard, her face pale and her eyes wide. "They're here," she said, pointing to the sky. "They're coming to take us away." I looked up, but all I could see were the stars twinkling in the night sky. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and a loud humming noise filled the air. I felt a strange sensation, like I was being lifted off the ground. The last thing I remember is Sally's voice, calling out to me as I was pulled into the sky. "I'm sorry, Michael," she said. "I couldn't stop them." And then, everything went black.